statistics show that students have 5 times lower dropout rates. Students are twice as likely to graduate college or university. And I also found that students' grade point averages or SAT scores are higher than those without art education opportunities. And I found that really interesting, those statistics. And from personal experience, I believe that I scored higher in my test results because my comparatively high exposure to the arts.
Welcome to another interview episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series on the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Maraika Lumholdt, the host of Tech in the Arts. Today, I'm very excited to interview Ellena, Sakai, and Blake Aber about their research for AMT Lab on arts education and geographic information systems for museums. Blake and Ellena, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Ellena, so you have been researching arts education. Do you think you could give a brief overview of the focus of your research?
Yeah, of course. So most of my research was based from my specific question: how does arts education opportunities impact students and their current and future careers? And to answer that question briefly, I found that students gain lifetime benefits from having that fundamental education in both public and private secondary schools. And there are statistics that can show that significance. In my preliminary research article, I lay out the arts core standards and processes, which are milestones built by the Americans for the Arts. And these are basically national core standards that exist in order for schools to aim for the highest level of arts education. However, there are some differences when it comes to looking at private and public schools within different regions around the US. I also touch on the importance of specifically the visual arts education, aside from performing or the musical side, and how the visual arts can carry other distinct benefits and opportunities for students that are developing their skills on a more participatory and proactive level.
I'd love to hear a little more about what inspired you to focus on this research. How have you benefited from arts education in your life?
So for me, I've had an abundance of arts education experiences, and it has significantly helped me build my artistic literacy. To go off of that, artistic literacy is basically cultivated by intuition, imagination, reasoning, and dexterity development. And to be specific, it has helped me express and find other unique forms of communication and engagement. And I feel like I've definitely benefited from this type of education, specifically the visual arts education, as it has been applicable to all other subjects like math or science when I took them. And it has greatly motivated me to learn, and this method of learning has improved my cognitive and creative skills also. To add a bit further to that, statistics show that students have 5 times lower dropout rates. Students are twice as likely to graduate college or university, and I also found that students' grade point averages or SAT scores are higher than those without art education opportunities. And I found that really interesting, those statistics. And from personal experience, I believe that I scored higher in my test results because my comparatively high exposure to the arts.
That's amazing. I know I feel so grateful for all the arts educational opportunities I've had throughout my life, so it's amazing to hear about how it's impacted others, and it sounds like there's so much data to back up their importance. So as an outsider, I find art standards around the US pretty confusing, and it seems like there's a lot of different rules and changes that have happened just in my lifetime. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how they work right now.
Yeah, so during my research, I also ended up getting really confused with all these standards within the arts, especially because there's like visual, performing, musical, etc. And I specifically took a look at the national core standards around the US for specific public and private schools, but there were regional, local standards that I could look at, and even some schools don't necessarily use those standards. They kind of adjust it on their own. But I think that these standards should definitely be narrowed down for a less, so that it's less confusing for private and public education.
Yeah, I imagine that administrators have a lot to think about as they're designing curriculums to be in line with all these different standards.
Yeah.
So something that I feel like was one of the biggest benefits for me doing arts growing up was how it fosters a feeling of belonging. Is that something that you found in your research in terms of how art impacts people's lives?
Yeah, definitely. There not only are there studies and statistics about academic improvement, there's definitely personal improvement that comes along with having that arts education. Yeah.
So obviously arts education is very broad. Sounds like you've been able to delve into a variety of different research areas within that topic. I'd love to know what the next steps are for you and where do you think you're headed from here with this research?
So I am planning on talking, or I would like to talk to um, varying teachers around the US who deal with the differences in standards, and maybe even teachers or professors who like come up with their own standards and see what their thoughts on it. And obviously, like, we think that it's pretty confusing, but I wonder if other teachers think that it's necessary and needed and maybe needs to be more developed. Maybe there needs to be more standards. Yeah, but I think that my next steps would be to kind of reach out to these teachers and get their insight and develop my research on that.
That sounds like a great place to go next, and I'm excited to hear more. For everyone listening, you'll have a forthcoming article on Arts Management and Technology Laboratory's website for your further research findings. So everyone stay tuned for that.
Because I'm not a good test taker, so like I think that without that education, I would be way in a worse spot than I am now.
Wow, test scores. That is something that I'm sure interests a lot of people and seems like a really good data point to back up the importance of arts education in our schools. How significant was the data that you were looking at when it showed impacts on test scores for students? Thank you so much, Ellena. We'll be sure to stay tuned for any updated research on your end. And Blake, I'd love to hear about your research with geographic information systems for museums specifically. Could you give a brief overview of what you've been looking at?
Yeah, when I first started thinking about geographic information systems, or GIS, I was really interested in figuring out how this data way of showing or visualizing data could be used in a museum space. This technology has been around for a while, and it's kind of sporadically used around the arts and specifically museums. And Jana Fredericks, who was a contributor for AMT Lab, actually did a lot of research on GIS and fundraising, but I was really interested in how that could be further used to actually get more people into museums, and then once people were in museums, also breaking down other barriers as opposed to like understanding certain content or just making people feel like they're actually welcome in the space, because I think a lot of the issues with a lot of museums in America is that it's almost like this temple on a hill and it's very inaccessible. So I really just started looking at a lot of case studies to see what museums were doing now in this space. Specifically, the Detroit Institute of Arts has been using GIS for quite some time to create a self-guided tour that is also implemented augmented reality, so people can really see the art they're showing come to life and get a different perspective on it, which I found to be very interesting and helpful for learning.
Yeah, that's really cool. I am definitely curious about the potential issues that GIS can be leveraged to solve. When do you think you noticed that it could be a tool to improve accessibility?
I interned at the Carnegie Museums over this past summer, and I was tasked with doing a market research project to see what museums were actually implementing access programs, whether that was a reduced price of admission or an actual access membership, reduced cost of membership. And I looked around at different art museums, natural history museums, science centers, and zoos, and I did find that a lot of museums were using access memberships based off of zip code. which was really interesting to me because you have to have some sort of data to pick which zip codes you're going to use for these access memberships. And so it kind of led me into wondering if these museums were using heat maps or a GIS system to get this data and to realize where their members were coming from or where people weren't coming from, and then trying to create access programs based off of that data set.
That's great. So it sounds like in terms of accessibility, welcoming, GIS can be leveraged a lot. Do you think that learning changes with GIS when it's implemented in exhibition design?
I don't necessarily have any studies to back it up, but my assumption is that GIS can create more of a relationship between the museum and the people who are viewing the pieces in a museum. I talked with GIS expert Chris Goranson about his thoughts in GIS being used for museum work, and he really emphasized the fact that GIS could be used to create these interactive designs for these exhibitions, which to me means that the more interaction you have, the more people are going to take away from these exhibitions. And I think something interesting I found when I was looking at my research was that a lot of public art offices use GIS to create interactive, self-guided tours. And I think when you give audience members more control over what they're seeing, it allows them to create their own journey, and in turn it may allow them to take more back with them when they leave the space.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. I don't have a visual arts background, so I have a great appreciation for it, but I find when I go to museums and have that opportunity to discover on my own and create my own connections, a stronger connection with the art that I was just seeing. So it sounds like maybe that's something that you'd potentially research going forward. We can cut that out if that's not true.
No, that's interesting.
Okay. We'll cut that. All right, and then same question. Anything since this initial podcast was recorded that you want to speak on in terms of like research findings or anything that stood out?
I'd like to speak on the fact that like even though GIS can be used as a tool for accessibility, it in itself is not accessible in many cases if you want to do higher level work with it, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So sounds like GIS is something that has a lot of potential to help in the museum field. I'm wondering if there are any limitations that you've discovered with it.
Definitely. I think it's very obvious, and in my findings I found quickly that GIS can be used to accomplish a lot of different things, especially depending on what software you're using. However, when I talked with Chris Goranson and Kristen Kurland, what I really found quickly was that museums, especially depending on their budget, may not have the knowledge and they may not have the money to be able to use GIS systems that can accomplish very high level projects. Specifically, ArcGIS is a great program, and you can use it to create VR experiences, but it's incredibly expensive, and even with their nonprofit program they have, it just might not be accessible for a smaller museum. There are several GIS software on the market that are free or very low cost, specifically for nonprofits who have Google through their nonprofit status. They can use Google Maps and play around with GIS capabilities if they want to kind of start exploring that space. But in terms of using it in a more high level way, cost and education is what's going to make implementation of GIS in museums slow.
Interesting. So a tool to help improve accessibility, but the tool itself not necessarily the most accessible right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we see with so many new technologies in the arts field that sometimes over time they can become more accessible. We'll see if that's the case with GIS, but an interesting future for sure and tool to consider. I'd love to hear about what your next steps are with this research. Is there anything you're diving deeper into going forward?
Yeah, I really dive deeper into the specific GIS software that's on the market, and what museums could practically take away from my research is the cost, the applications that the software can have for museums that have wanted to try out GIS but maybe have been kind of lost in the sea of multiple GIS softwares that exist.
Well, we will stay tuned for that research. And again, for anyone listening, to read more about both Ellena and Blake's research, you can visit amtlab.org. So, two very interesting topics in two very different parts of the arts world. I'm wondering if through your research you found any overlapping areas between these topics.
Well, I do see an overlap in the inherent benefits for when people interact with art. And I find it really interesting that these benefits are hard to gain without proper access, when we were just talking about, to these art opportunities. Do you see any other connections?
Yeah, I think something we both have talked about at length was art does create a sense of belonging for communities. Mm-hmm. There was a study done by the Knight Foundation in 2020 that proved that people tend to stay in places because of certain offerings that their community has, and cultural spaces, access to art was one of those. And I think that there's no argument that art is beneficial to people, but if you don't have access in art through education or just through your social personal life, if you can't go to a museum and get benefit out of that, then it's really not doing anything for you.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great point to leave our listeners to ponder. Thank you both again so much for sharing your research. And again, for everyone listening, please visit amtlab.org to read more about Blake and Ellena's work. Thank you for listening to Tech in the Arts. Be on the lookout for new episodes coming to you soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send this to another arts aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amtlab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts, or on Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.